Hello, everyone. My name is Sabreena Delhon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Samara Centre for Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Detoxing Democracy, Addressing Toxicity in Online Political Conversations. We'll begin with a presentation about SAMbot, a Samara Centre initiative that tracks toxicity in online conversations. Then we'll move into our panel discussion with three experts in law, human rights, and journalism to explore potential solutions to the complex problem that is online toxicity. The Samara Centre works to make our country's democracy more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. Inherent to this work is an understanding that Indigenous laws, systems of governance, and ways of knowing are foundational to what we now understand as Canada's approach to democracy. With that understanding, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you are joining us from today. A few notes before we get started. The webinar is open for questions, the webinar chat is open for questions or for help. As well, we'll be sharing relevant links and resources in the chat as well. This webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing it following the event. As well, we'll be sending a short post-event survey to get your feedback on what you thought of the program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Alex McIsaac, who is the Samara Centre's SAMbot coordinator, and he'll be sharing some new insights from our tracking of the 2021 federal election. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Sabreena. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alex McIsaac, and I'm the SAMbot project coordinator at the Samara Centre for Democracy. And today I'm going to provide you all with a quick overview of what the SAMbot project is, and we'll share some new findings from our 2021 federal election SAMbot deployment. During this past federal election, there was an average of 551 likely toxic tweets sent to track candidates every hour. That's about one toxic tweet every 7 seconds. In the last 2 years, stories of candidates and elected officials from all levels of government receiving increased levels of hate and toxicity have made headlines. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service has shared that they've observed a marked increase in violent threats against politicians, and members of parliament have been recently given personal panic buttons as an additional security measure due to an increase in threats received by MPs. There's a prevailing sense within Canadian political discourse that toxicity has and is continuing to rise. But aside from fragmented accounts of individual candidates and elected officials receiving hate, we have little data to quantify the online toxicity problem within Canadian political discourse. And that's where the Samara Areto Monitor Bot, or SAMbot, comes in. SAMbot is a collaboration that draws on Canadian machine learning technology from our technical partner Areto Labs to track toxic sentiment on Twitter during Canadian elections. So before an election happens, we search for and compile the Twitter accounts for every official candidate in an election that has an active and publicly accessible Twitter account so that SAMbot can track the tweets that they receive. SAMbot then tracks and records every tweet during an election period where a candidate's Twitter handle is mentioned. It does this by extracting the tweet information, scoring the tweet against 7 toxicity attributes, and then storing both the tweet text and its toxicity scores in a database for later analysis. Now, in addition to tracking sentiment, SAMbot can also assess whether a tweet contains elements of other toxicity attributes, such as insults, profanity, threats, identity attacks, or sexually explicit content. For more detailed information on our methodology, please see our About page on sambot.ca. In this recent federal election, SAMbot tracked 298 candidates' Twitter accounts. 296 of these candidates were incumbents, while just 2 were party leaders who were not incumbents, those being the now former Green Party of Canada leader, Anna-May Paul, and the People's Party of Canada leader, Maxime Bernier. Now, SAMbot allowed us to see the stunning volume of toxic comments that candidates receive. SAMbot analyzed over 2.5 million tweets, and over 475,000 of these tweets were labeled as likely toxic. Now, because language is so complex and context dependent, machine learning bots like SAMbot can never ensure perfect accuracy. Thus, we refer to tweets flagged as toxic by SAMbot as likely toxic tweets. But this data shows that more than 1 in 6 of all analyzed tweets during this election were likely to be toxic. And the volume of different types of toxic messages are also cause for alarm. In this election, we tracked over 290,000 tweets labeled as containing threats, 210,000 tweets labeled as identity attacks, and over 140,000 tweets labeled as containing sexually explicit messages. Now, a majority of all toxicity, about 70%, was directed at just these 6 party leaders. This chart shows that among the 6 party leaders, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau received by far the highest number of total tweets and of likely toxic tweets among them. 42% of likely toxic tweets across all candidates that we tracked were directed to Trudeau. But the statistics on volume that were shown here alone don't tell the whole story. Looking at how toxicity is spread proportionally can help show the rate at which likely toxic tweets were received by candidates. Looking at this next chart, Prime Minister Trudeau remains on top. But unlike before, now former Green Party of Canada leader Anna-May Paul is only slightly behind the Prime Minister. Despite her much lower volume of tweets, over 20% of tweets she received were likely toxic. This means that over 1 in 5 tweets sent to both Trudeau and to Paul during this election were likely to be toxic. And then toxicity attributes can also help tell the story. Here are the 3 most common toxicity attributes received among party leaders. Notably, Anna-May Paul once again had unique outcomes, as she was the only leader to receive identity attacks as their most common toxicity attribute, with Jagmeet Singh being the only other leader to have identity attacks crack their top 3. Now, this is just a fraction of our findings from a recently released 2021 federal election snapshot. So for more, I urge you to check out SAMbot.ca after this event. Our aim with SAMbot was to carve off a small slice of the toxic political conversation online and examine it in detail. The SAMbot project is a matter of measuring the obvious, and our findings have resonated with the media, with journalists, and the wider political community. It's helped to validate the experiences of those who frequently face online toxicity by quantifying the toxic sentiment that is widely spread in online spaces. Now, our findings don't provide absolute or definitive conclusions about the conversation nationally or even just within Canadian federal politics. However, we can share these high-level and accessible insights about the state of the political conversation online that can potentially help drive policy and culture-based solutions. Now, our work on the 2021 federal election is helping shape how we decide to deploy SAMbot in other elections and contexts in the future. Going forward, we want to increase our understanding about how toxicity is spread and who it's predominantly directed towards. This could be advanced through accessing self-identified demographic data from candidates. Currently, collecting and using this type of self-reported data at scale is a challenge, but we're keen to work with others to address this challenge, as related findings could help illuminate issues relating to representation in our democracy. SAMbot will also be deployed during upcoming municipal and party leadership elections, so stay tuned for more information on those deployments. And as I mentioned earlier, we just released the SAMbot 2021 federal election snapshot. So for more findings and for access to all the data that we've collected, please visit SAMbot.ca. If you'd like more information on SAMbot or have suggestions for our work, please do get in touch. Thank you all for your time and attention this morning, or this afternoon rather, and I'll I'll turn it over to our panelists now.
Thanks so much, Alex, for that thorough overview of SAMbot and for walking us through those results in depth. We will be sharing a link to the full federal election snapshot in the chat. I think it's already there now. SAMbot is enabling the Samara Centre to better understand how technology is shaping our democratic culture. And today we've brought together experts from across sectors to learn about how we can mitigate online toxicity to create safer spaces for civic engagement. With us today is Amira Elghawaby, a journalist and human rights advocate who's been involved in numerous initiatives to communicate and promote inclusion. She's the Director of Strategic Communications and Campaigns at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Shari Graydon is the Director of Informed Opinions, which is working to amplify women's voices and make Canada more democratic. A current Informed Opinions initiative is the Toxic Hush campaign, which aims to end online hate targeting women. And we also have Rosel Kim joining us. She's a staff lawyer at the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, LEAF. She leads LEAF's Technology Facilitated Violence Project, which explores equality-centered legal responses to technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. The SAMbot presentation from Alex really highlights the volume and the intensity of online toxicity during elections. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how findings from a project like that relate to the work that you are currently doing. Amira, could you start us off?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sabreena. Thanks very much, the Samara Centre for Democracy, for convening us all on this really timely conversation. I'm joining you from Ottawa on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. So the SAMbot, report is very valuable because what it does is it quantifies what many people are experiencing online, unfortunately, when it comes to online abuse. So it looks at obviously the political space, but beyond sort of what politicians are experiencing, we know, as we've seen, in the past few weeks, almost a campaign of attacks, online abuse against journalists, many of whom are female, racialized journalists, who are receiving horrific online abuse right now. And so why this research is important is it gives us a real snapshot of the types of attacks that people can experience online. For instance, whether it's identity attacks, whether it's attacks against people's political stance. So it allows for that quantification because, quite frankly, all of us are on social media. We will see hateful comments from time to time, especially as women. And yet we don't necessarily understand the full scope of the problem unless we see that sort of analysis of the numbers. And it is quite shocking. It's something we're aware of, but when you see it broken down in the way that the SAMbot has done for us in this report, it really quantifies the extent and the depth of the problem and how it may certainly scare people from feeling comfortable enough, rightfully so, of participating. And that's what we want to avoid because, of course, it has a direct link on how strong, robust, and inclusive our democracy is.
Thanks. Rosel, I'll go to you next. What does it mean in your work in the legal world when we're able to quantify, a small slice of the political conversation in this way?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and also for sharing the findings from the report. And I'll just echo what Amira has said so far about the importance of quantifying the issue. And part of my work, as you mentioned, is to lead the Technology Facilitated Violence Project at LEAF, and it's examining the impact of tech-facilitated violence on gender equality from an intersectional perspective. And one of the things that we've been calling on to the federal government is to fund research that is like the findings from SAMbot report, because we need to know what is happening on the ground in order to be able to name the problem, identify the problem, and also to come up with solutions. And the disaggregated data that's being provided here, it will provide good evidentiary ground for LEAF to call on for equality-based solutions. So thank you again for this work that you've been leading.
Well, I'm glad to hear that's the that it's the response to SAMbot and that it's actually helpful. Shari, at Informed Opinions, you are also measuring related variables. How does a project like SAMbot, that's looking at a very specific time-bound event like an election, relate to the work that you're working on?
I think the SAMbot research is really critically useful. Not only does it unpack the identity issues that are central to why Informed Opinions even got into this space. We're a really small organization, but what happened for us was that we went to women in our database, expert women who with intersectional identities, to say, how can we support more women in your communities to speak up in the media? And that's what alerted us to the incredible impact of this issue. And so your research with the SAMbot really, just what Alex called out about the fact that Annamie Paul, with a fraction of the profile of the Prime Minister, that the identity attacks, that the nature of the abuse that she received, and then to a lesser extent Jagmeet Singh received, really reinforces what for us is a critical piece, and that is that although white men like Justin Trudeau may be targeted, the nature of the abuse directed at them is often really qualitatively different, and the impact of that difference in abuse is something that's really important for us to unpack and understand in order to effectively deal with it. So we see this as an existential threat to not just democracy as a whole, but to equality and the participation of women and people with intersectional or diverse identities participating.
Well, that relates to my next question for Amira. Amira, you've been involved in multiple initiatives to understand and address prevalence of hate speech, most recently with the Victims of Hate report. Can you share more about your findings and recommendations coming out of that report?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Canadian Race Relations Foundation recently released a report identifying how victims of hate, whether they're experiencing it online or offline, are often really not finding anywhere to go for support and help. It's really quite sad to see, for instance, the various female journalists that actually documented and have been sharing on social media how difficult it was even for them to report the abuse and the threats, the real threats that they have received for their lives to police. And that's where people have the wherewithal to report at all. So for instance, we know that when it comes to reporting hate, 80% of people in Canada who've said that they've been victims of it haven't gone to police at all. So where do people turn? And that's where a report comes in to say, the federal government really can step up to take further leadership to provide funding support to organizations like Informed Opinions, like other community organizations that are trying to prepare and create space for people to come forward, to find support, to find a community of folks who are able to walk them through those processes if they do choose to report what they're going through. And of course, what we've also seen from the Canadian Association of Journalists alongside Global News, Toronto Star, the Hill Times calling on police services themselves to do better, to do much, much better in terms of the training that they're providing frontline officers to really have a victim-centered approach and how they are responding to concerns, real concerns that people are having, whether it's online abuse or again, in the real quote unquote world. So that's really a gap that's there at the moment. And again, this type of data, this type of conversation is so crucial, because if we don't have this conversation, the real consequences is that many folks, in particular women and racialized people, are going to shrink away from participating fully in our society. And that is the worst case scenario, because that will harm everyone writ large.
Mm-hmm. Rosel, I'm going to turn to you now. LEAF has been a strong advocate for increased government regulation to address technology-facilitated violence, particularly hate aimed at women online. Can you share how feminist law reform can address online toxicity. What recourse do people have? As Amira just noted, it doesn't feel like there's really anywhere to turn.
Yeah, definitely. And the unfortunate reality right now is that legal responses are very lacking to address this really growing problem. And part of the reason for that is that the criminal law is a very blunt instrument where, you know, there are very high evidentiary requirements to meet to prove that something is a threat or something constitutes hate expression. And of course, that is for good reason, because a criminal conviction comes with really serious consequences, but the impact of that, of course, also ends up being that a lot of the survivors and people experiencing this kind of hate are bearing the brunt of, you know, not only sort of being the target of the hate, but also then having to navigate very inaccessible systems and, you know, the complaint procedures of platforms that also are not very accessible. So a couple of things that LEAF has been calling for, I'll just highlight two of them, is in providing immediate and direct support to survivors. And so we call for this in the form of an independent central regulator, you know, who would be staffed by experts, you know, who can provide victim-centered, trauma-informed approaches. And it really, you know, would be a place where someone experiencing tech-facilitated violence could call or contact to say, this is what's happening, what are my options, that this regulator could provide, you know, information, but also advocacy if that's what the survivor wants, and with the survivor's consent, connect them with other legal responses if that's what they wish to pursue. And the second thing I'll note is that, you know, we're also calling for the government to provide legal reform so that there will be increased transparency from the tech companies and platforms where this kind of expression is being shared and multiplied. So some of the transparency measures would be to, you know, have the companies undergo an audit and also answer questions about how they're dealing with complaints and, you know, and other kinds of, you know, requests to remove certain expression or to you know, to just deal with the kinds of complaints so we know what they're doing or what they're not doing.
So Shari, in your work at Informed Opinions, you're building on a lot of what Rosel just identified here, and I'm thinking in particularly with the victim-centered trauma-informed approach. Can you talk about the important work that you've been doing most recently with the People's Tribunal that was held in June and the Toxic Hush campaign? What are you learning from carrying out this type of work?
Well, really what we wanted to do, we convened, as you mentioned, a People's Tribunal around the impact of online hate, and we brought together, Amira included, and Rosel. It was great to have women with intersectional identities who either had direct experience and or who were doing the kind of advocacy and legal analysis work that LEAF has been doing. In addition, we had three really respected, distinguished judges in Senator Kim Pate, in Juanit Corn-Miller, and in Dean Donna Young from the Metropolitan University Law School, to really shine a spotlight on the impact of online hate of women, particularly with intersectional identities, and to talk about the potential framework for a legal context. So the Tribunal Report that we produced out of the event, I'll just share that and you can reshare it, it really gives a rich and nuanced understanding, not only of the impact, but of the sort of broader legal framework. And, you know, I think in Canada, we watch so much American TV, and so the United States legal context is often confused for our own. But as Senator Kim Pate in her remarks during the tribunal noted, that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms seeks to balance rights in relation to one another, and freedom of speech is not absolute. There's no constitutional right to threaten, to rape, or kill a woman just because you disagree with her politics. And violent speech is not constitutionally protected. And so our goal in convening the tribunal and in launching the Toxicity campaign was to really awaken Canadians who are not being affected to the depth and impact of this abuse, and to say specifically to the Canadian government, we need regulation. Other countries are doing this, some more successfully than others. We absolutely need to hold the platforms accountable. All these other measures that we're talking about feel to me like necessary but interim. And really the platforms have the resources and have the ability to be more accountable in ways that they're not. And it's going to probably take governments to enact legislation and enforce penalties for them to step up and do what is no doubt going to be expensive, but it's really on them to do that. And that was the focus of our work, to really help build that case.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to open the floor now for the following questions. So everyone just feel free to jump in as you see fit. So on the policy and regulatory front and legal frameworks, we know those are critical to mitigating online toxicity. Those are really important tools, but they take time. And in the meanwhile, people are facing a torrent of vitriol, as Alex's presentation illustrated for us. And Amira, you touched on this recently. The Canadian Association of Journalists shared a list of demands to better protect those in the profession, because most recently they faced coordinated attacks, particularly directed at journalists of color who are women. So how can we better support those affected by online toxicity while we're waiting for these bigger structural pieces to come into effect? How can we make it safe for people to do their jobs if it's a requirement that they also be online to do that work?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Amira.
I mean, I'll just jump in to say that, you know, I don't really have an answer to that, because we've been having these types of conversations for several years now. And, you know, I think as we are indeed, Sabreena, as you've noted, waiting for the federal government to take action, and, you know, they have been taking various steps. They've, you know, been consulting with Canadians. They have had an expert advisory group that has just sort of completed their own recommendations that came out in June. You know, it's really, the ball's in the federal government's court. They seem to have taken all the due diligence that they can take. In the meantime, as you say, people are still experiencing this type of horrific behavior. You know, I think it almost seems sometimes a little bit oversimplistic, but why aren't some users just being removed from these platforms if they are engaging in abusive behaviors? You know, I think of one, for example, individual who, you know, was tormenting a Muslim Canadian businessman online, and then it actually spilled over into real life. And you know, it took a multi-millionaire businessman to take this individual to court. You know, Mohammed Faqih, who was successful in that court case, and was able to have this individual, you know, be held somewhat accountable. And yet this individual still has a platform on Facebook, still has a Facebook channel. And so it just seems quite odd that even while the courts are calling speech hateful and therefore illegal, that the platforms struggle, if I'm to be charitable, to actually take these people off the platforms. They should be removed if they have been shown to be harassing and raising, you know, hateful rhetoric, and basically mobilizing other like-minded individuals to organize and to create sort of these coordinated campaigns. And obviously the rise of the right and white supremacist groups, all of this is sort of a perfect storm. And it's as though these tools are, just sitting there for them to use as they see fit, while all of us are looking on and wondering when someone is going to put their foot down. And so I think that doesn't really answer the question, because I don't really know what answer is available to people like myself, like others who do receive these horrific messages, and yet very little seems to be done about it.
I would love to build on Amira's comments. I totally concur with all of them, and also found it difficult to answer the question because it is a brutal and devastating experience that so many are having, and there is no easy way to support them. But one of the things that occurred to me from the long time work that Informed Opinions and Media Watch, our predecessor, did around targeting advertisers. So, this also takes collective action. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think there are so many people who, listening to Amira's comments, absolutely agree that it's inconceivable and unconscionable that people continue to be permitted a platform, and to go to the advertisers on Twitter and Facebook and to say, you are, by supporting and advertising on this platform, you are complicit in this abuse. Because if our individual voices can be dismissed because they have millions or hundreds of millions or billions of users, advertisers' dollars have more of a potential impact. And I think targeting advertisers and insisting that, we're now equating the abuse on this platform with your corporation, and you might want to talk to Facebook and Twitter about that, because they do have the power and resources to do some of the things that Amira mentioned.
I wanted to just build on what what everyone has been saying, and talking about the sort of the corporate interests and how they have been shaping the types of content that are promoted and amplified. So if you look at the business models of the platforms, they tend to prioritize, what's engaging content. And unfortunately, that means content that's abusive, that's content that's extreme, content that's violent. And for so long, this is the type of content that have been promoted, and that's why there's been so sort of little uptake on really moderating things from a human rights and equality center perspective. So everything, all of the recommendations that LEAP has been making, one of the central ones that I forgot to mention earlier is that any kind of legal reform and policy reform have to name equality and human rights as the guiding principle, and really trying to hold the platforms to account as well. And it is really difficult, like Amira and Shari have said, it's to come up with a simple solution to an issue that's so deeply rooted in systemic oppression that's existed for so long. And I think the one thing I could say about, one thing we could do, which is not simple, is to sort of commit to addressing this from a survivor and equality-centered mindset, and really investing in, identifying and addressing survivors' needs. And even if they might not match what we think they need or what we think is as a collective, and that takes time, and it's going to take also, a commitment from us to sort of give up our power if we have that, and also share it, and potentially being vulnerable ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about the framing of this experience as a condition of work, as a part of the labor experience. Rosel, do you see any kind of advantage or possibility through that kind of lens, because it seems that when people hear online toxicity or online hate, it's so broad and overwhelming. But if you talk to people about their experience at work, harassment at work, threats at work, it feels a bit more real. It feels a bit more like it really kind of hits home harder. Do you think there's any advantage to working that kind of angle in addition to this human rights and equality orientation as well?
Yeah, I think there could
Legal
be
information, not legal advice, but yeah.
yes, totally. I can't provide legal advice on that, but I think there could be something something there, and also just understanding this as a workplace safety issue. As Amira mentioned, it's not, being online is really integral to a lot of people's jobs, but especially for journalists. So advice like going offline really doesn't work, and it's not going to make the violence go away. And I think, shift, or not shifting, but thinking about how employers can better support employees going through the violence and abuse. I think some of the advice or some of the calls that we've been making about creating an independent agency that could apply to some workplaces as well, in terms of putting resources to having a point person that people can go to who can provide the kind of guidance and information about immediate steps to long-term steps, and providing things that employees might need, whether that's paid time off or other kinds of counseling or support and resources. I think those are some concrete steps that employers could take.
Well, I want to shift to the experience of people who just see the toxicity online and might not be receiving it themselves, but the impact it has on them. So we know that the toxic content that's online reverberates through our digital public square. So even if this content isn't coming directly at you, it's creating spaces that don't feel safe and that are hindering healthy discourse and debate. And we've touched on this already. This takes a toll on representation and participation in our democracy too. How can we change that? We're talking about big structural changes that we would like to see, but is there something, and it feels small and not fair to put this on the individual, but are there things that people can do online, or challenges they can make to technology platforms to advance a bit of a culture shift in how we're responding or reacting to the toxicity we see? Is this a bystander intervention opportunity? What are people supposed to do when they see something that they know is wrong and it feels wrong?
I think one of the challenges, I certainly experienced this. We Informed Opinion supports thousands of women in amplifying their voices in the media, which by definition makes them more of a target. And we've struggled with how can we support them, if we weigh in on their Twitter feed or we clap back at the abuser. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. One of the fears many people have around doing that is now you're the target, and all of Jonathan Kay's vicious followers are going to lob on to you. And so yeah, it's really a struggle. Sabreena, you and I were talking yesterday about what difference it might make if we had really high profile, powerful white male allies. So CEOs or athletes or entertainers who are not being subjected, most of them, to the kind of vitriol that the population who's most often targeted is. And if they were to launch a campaign that really equated trolling with being a loser, that really questioned the masculinity of cowards who hide behind anonymity, who to hurl abuse at others, and that made clear that such behavior was unacceptable, that it rendered the perpetrators unworthy of respect or maybe employment in their organizations. One of the things that I've really wrestled with, the more I understand this issue, is the willingness of platforms to grant anonymity to users. And, you don't get a letter published in the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail or the National Post without them verifying that you are a human being and including your name. And I think that's a completely legitimate expectation. And that alone, if platforms were required to do that, would stop it from being an individual problem that those being targeted are forced to have to deal with.
Or even the whole issue around the algorithms, right? The algorithms, and I think Rosel kind of touched upon this, that have built into them this feature where the angrier people are, the more likely that post is going to be shared and amplified. And so what you have, it's this horrific echo chamber with like the more abusive you are, the more hateful you are, the more likely other people are going to be seeing your post. And so part of some of the recommendations that have been coming out from various organizations, including, for instance, the Public Policy Forum, which has its Commission on Democratic Expression, which has put out now 2 reports, talks about the transparency around the algorithm. So that's not so much on the individual level, but it's important for us to understand that why do we keep seeing posts that are angry or are hateful if we are online? It's because there is something else at play here. It's not necessarily that these are the most popular or that the majority of folks actually agree with this. It's just that there is a sliver of the population that agrees with it, and because they're engaged with it, that somehow gets pushed out further and further into our spaces. And so that's really important just in terms of just education. And that is also an area where you've seen a lot of recommendations, the whole media literacy and online literacy. When you look at the fact that it is young people as well who are on these platforms, who are the most exposed to hateful, abusive, racist, misogynistic, sexist, all of these different horrible forms of discriminatory behavior, they are being exposed to that. And so how are they coping with it? How are they being equipped to address this and understand it and unpack it and report it and all of those sorts of things? So you don't also see that recommendation that we have to be supporting young people. It's not enough for us to say, well, holler back at them, maybe post, because you're also obviously putting yourself at risk of abuse when you're, sticking up for others, which of course, for those who can, that is really helpful. And it's very important to say something if you can, but other people may be worried, and rightfully so again. So the whole idea around education, understanding how these platforms work on the one end, and on the other end, understanding our role and what young people are seeing, and how that is also going to influence their reluctance or enthusiasm for further participating.
If I could just add to that, the other thing, really concerning about the schooling that is happening in online spaces is that it is teaching a level of incivility and polarization. So, in addition to some people being targeted, other young people witnessing, oh, this is how we behave. This is acceptable. This is supported. There are not laws to change these algorithms or punish the perpetrators of this hate. And that is also deeply concerning.
Rosel?
Yeah, I just agree with everything that's been said, and the importance of education is definitely something I will echo, and that's something we would like the regulator, if there is one, it's created to be able to do so as well to young people, but also to justice system actors to sort of recognize when something is abusive, and also that something that's happening online is not separate from real life, and it is serious and it has real impacts.
So Shari, you mentioned this earlier about this kind of overrepresentation of American law, legal crime dramas in Canadian public consciousness. How do we account for freedom of expression when we're talking about hate speech online in this way? What is some kind of what are some clarifying elements that we need to convey to the public so they understand that this isn't hate speech versus freedom of expression? What's a way for us to kind of put this to rest in terms of what the expectations are and what the boundaries are for how we communicate with one another in this country?
I wish I had an easy solution to that. You know, I think I prefaced my comment about that with a reference to how much American television we all watch. And I recall that during the Freedom Convoy, so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, those protests that shut down the city and really infringed on the rights of many people living in the city, that somebody who was ultimately prosecuted, brought before a judge, stood up in court and claimed their so-called Second Amendment or First Amendment rights. Well, you know, that's not our law. And so the rampant confusion that exists is not something that we're easily going to overcome. But I think having a regular discussion where we talk in really accessible language, because, you know, one of the challenges, and Rosel would be really acutely sensitive to this, is that the nature of legal discussions often uses very sophisticated language and concepts that most of us didn't go to law school, don't understand. And, you know, it was very powerful for me in the tribunal when Kim Pate spoke and said, no constitutional right to threaten, to kill, or rape a woman, full stop. I think people get that. And so we need to be actively incorporating those understandings in our conversations so that there is an appreciation that, you know, yes, you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. We in Canada balance the protection of individual rights against the collective good. And that's something that we have historically valued and appreciated because it has a demonstrable impact on our ability to live our lives in a way that has not subjected us to, for example, the level of gun violence that operates in the US. And so I think really proactively seeding those values and commitments in public conversations is a critical thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And just to jump in, yeah, okay, yeah.
Oh no, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosel. So just to jump in too, it's like the question has to be asked of whose freedom of expression are we protecting? And so Evan Balgord, who's the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, has a great quote, and it really puts it into perspective. It's, you know, the free expression of women, people of colors, and others is more valuable than the hate speech of trolls. And that's just a way to just say, look, you know, and as Shari mentioned, and I'm sure Rosel will touch upon, our constitutional rights are not absolute. You know, there is a space where, you know, hate speech is not considered protected speech. It is not. The courts have ruled that. Our Supreme Court of Canada has already ruled on that. So I think the problem with this conversation is that people come at it without necessarily understanding fully the difference between speech and hate speech.
Mm-hmm. Rosel?
Yeah, I would say all the points I was going to mention have been covered, but just to reiterate that no charter rights are absolute, and we recognize that individual charter rights can be limited and balanced to protect collective rights and also other rights like right to equality, and there is no hierarchy of rights as well. And it is very important to think about freedom of expression of not just the person who's making an expression that's harmful, but to really consider what's the impact of that expression on, you know, on the other folks and their right to equality and their right to freedom of expression. So, and, you know, and ultimately our democracy depends on being able to participate without fear and to express yourself without fearing for your life. And, you know, what's the impact of the expression if that it will limit that, right? So just the need to really consider things from different perspectives.
Yeah, and what's ultimately at stake.
Mm-hmm.
At the top of this conversation, we talked about the SAMbot presentation and how those numbers can have a legitimizing and validating effect. And I'm wondering now, for us to get a more holistic view of the impact of online toxicity, the cost to our democracy, what else should we be measuring?
Informed Opinions has been wrestling with this, what else we could do to contribute to this conversation. And the conclusion I've come to through many conversations, including with some of you, and is reinforced by this conversation, and that is that measurement and data is important, but I'm thinking now Informed Opinions is going to pivot away from research and focus on advocacy and focus on reframing the conversation. I love the condition of work framing that you mentioned, Sabreena. Journalists, politicians, advocates for change, they are essential to our democracy. And when one of them complains to the police about being targeted with a violent threat, and they're encouraged to just go offline as if that's a thing. And when I get asked in interviews, well, what is the real life impact of online hate? Online hate is real life. If you're a journalist, an advocate, a politician, that is fundamental to your ability to communicate with the people in the audience who are needing news or information. So my bias now is for action targeting governments, targeting platforms, and engaging a broad population who fundamentally supports the kind of values that I think we share in demanding better.
I think just to continue on what else you might need, I think it is important to understand the state of inequality in our society, and to the extent that's possible, to measure the impact of, like, how is the toxicity impacting the number of people in leadership positions, number of people who leave their jobs, and is there any difference in the rates of sexual violence, hate incidents, so that we can really get a picture of what else that they, not what else, but just, just understanding that, how the growing inequality in our society is, contributing to the toxicity.
Amira?
Yeah, I think I also agree with the point of, have we not measured enough here? How much more do we need to measure? Survey after survey has demonstrated how young people and older people are experiencing hate online and abuse online. I think over 90% of Canadians agree that regulation is required. That's a really high number of people. Most people agree. We can see that there is a problem. Do we need to continue to measure that problem? I think what I would love to start measuring is the solutions. How do these eventual solutions that eventually get implemented, how do they start changing what people are experiencing online? So I think many of us who have been in this space for a long time are ready to measure success. Canada has a real opportunity right now. There are many jurisdictions globally. Germany is one, UK, New Zealand, other countries around the world have tried different things already. Some have worked, some have not worked so well. Some have had negative impacts. For instance, we have known that there are concerns when you do provide or create a framework where content has to be removed very quickly. And so we have sometimes seen that takedown approach can actually harm the very communities you're trying to protect. So we've seen, for example, posts involving Black Lives Matter or Palestinian rights, etc., be removed by these platforms in, quote unquote, an effort to address online hate. And so there is understandably some reticence as well And I think we definitely have to acknowledge that around, how much power are we placing in these platforms and how the government will regulate that, and whether or not the government has the expertise to be able to do this properly. But that all being said, I recently wrote, perfection cannot be the enemy of the good. We cannot remain in this sort of, period of stasis, unsure what to do. We will make some mistakes, but I think what's very clear is that, Canadians are ready for some movement on this, some regulation to start bringing all of this into some kind of framework with a regulator, with a duty to act responsibly on these platforms, with mechanisms for users to be able to find support should they need it. And of course, as Rosel mentioned and Shari, how do we support victims of these harms? That's very critical as well. So I think we're all ready, if I can put it mildly. We're all ready to see some forward action to help protect those who are most vulnerable to this type of harm.
Well, and the mindset that you're proposing, Amira, about being just open about trying something and refining from there, I think is a really important shift. And when you talk about how high the support for regulation is, it really underscores how small the group creating this toxicity is as well, and how outsized their impact on our democracy is too. So we're going to leave it there for today. I want to thank you all so much for such a critical and insightful conversation on behalf of the Samara Centre and our audience. It's been really wonderful to learn from you all today. So thank you so much for your time and expertise. For the audience, please watch for a follow-up email with relevant links from what we touched on in this conversation. And we'll also be sharing an event feedback survey and would really be grateful for audience input there. Thanks so much, everybody, for attending this webinar, and we look forward to continuing this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.